Welcome to the Word on Fire Institute. I'm Andrew Petiprin, Fellow of Popular Culture, and today we're discussing Pope Francis's latest encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti. I'm joined here by two of my colleagues, Assistant Director of the Word on Fire Institute, Matthew Nelson. Matt, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm great. Glad to be together.
Should be good.
And on this side, Robert Mixa, Fellow of Education. Bobby, how are you?
I'm good, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Well, I think it should be a great discussion. Fratelli Tutti is very much in people's minds in the Catholic world, and there have been a lot of commentaries and things said about it so far, and we're excited to add our voices as evangelists this morning. We think about the context of Fratelli Tutti as an addition to the deposit of Catholic social teaching. And as Catholics, this is what the Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us about Catholic social teaching writ large, that it is our vocation to beatitude. And the Catechism expresses it like this: the Beatitudes depict the countenance of Jesus Christ and portray his charity. They express the vocation of the faithful associated with the glory of his passion and resurrection. They shed light on the actions and attitudes characteristic of the Christian life. They are the paradoxical promises that sustain hope in the midst of tribulations. They proclaim the blessings and rewards already secured, however dimly, for Christ's disciples. They have begun in the lives of the Virgin Mary and all the saints. So that context of our vocation to beatitude is how we are reading Fratelli Tutti and how we encourage you to think about it today as well. The first thing that we want to talk about is the title itself, Fratelli Tutti, brothers all. Where does that term come from and why does it matter? Bobby, I was thinking about how in the document, Pope Francis only quotes from or references Vatican II documents three times. And two of those references are from Gaudium et Spes, where we get some language of brotherhood. Tell us about how that works in the document.
Yeah, well, to understand Gaudium et Spes properly, you have to kind of go back to the French Revolution. Vatican II in general was a little bit of a response to that. But the word brotherhood or fraternity was used back then. And the church in the 1930s started to hear this language come back with kind of after the communists were taking hold, and they heard words like fraternity being used. But people like Henri de Lubac recognized that, hey, this has a Christian origin. And so the kind of ressourcement movement that he was a part actually found its blossoming in a document like Gaudium et Spes. So the first part of Gaudium et Spes, which is an address to the modern world, you find language like brotherhood and addressing all of mankind, but it's very particular in its use in saying that it's in Christ that mankind finds its brotherhood. But here I could see Francis, not explicitly saying that, but making his way there. So, yeah, Gaudium et Spes. Actually, I think he quotes the first paragraph, and then also paragraph 24.
That's right, 1 and 24.
Yeah, and 24 is really important because there you get the kind of the anthropology of gift, that man only finds himself in a sincere gift of himself.
And that's the exact quote that Pope Francis uses in the text, I believe.
Yeah. And so, that's kind of like foreshadowing what's going to come to light in Revelation, what we see, in the Trinitarian persons. But man only, I think what he can do is say, hey, this ecstatic part of mankind, of man having to go out of himself to find himself, is crucial to being a human being. So he's kind of trying to get away from this individualism and collectivism at the same time, but trying to say that man is only himself in community.
Yeah. And, brotherhood is not, for an American reader, it's not really a word that we use that often.
No.
And so we really do need to kind of understand the pedigree of that word in the church. And if I could just read this bit from Gaudium et Spes to reinforce what you've already said. It says, God, who has fatherly concern for everyone, has willed that all men should constitute one family and treat one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So I take it that that's kind of the context of brotherhood that Pope Francis is encouraging us to think about in the text. He goes on further into the text, into the introduction and in the first paragraph, then to kind of talk about the blessings and the challenges of that brotherhood, and specifically also references the health crisis that we've been going on globally, and all of these things where we're bound together, and that's just a fact. We just are. And another one, Matt, would be in terms of technology. What is your take on Pope Francis's kind of diagnosis of where we are with the digital age and its gifts and its potential problems?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you definitely see throughout the encyclical, you see this recurrence of his mention of the digital age. And to be honest with you, often he's commenting on the difficulties presented by the digital age. That being said, I think it's wrong to read this encyclical as though he's writing with this severe cynicism of sorts. I think Pope Francis is pro-technology for sure. I think he's pro-internet, he's pro-science, but he's warning us that we can take things too far. In a way, I see a sort of tradition he's following with what we read in multiple places and heard multiple times from Pope Benedict XVI, and his emphasis that science is good. We as Bishop Barron says, we revere science and what they can do. But Pope Benedict would often warn us that too often in our modern culture, we put this focus on the question, what can I do? And we make that primary. What we make secondary is the question, what ought I do? So we push the sciences as far as we can. And if we can do it, we're going to try to do it. And I think Pope Francis is kind of continuing this sort of careful fatherly warning to all those who are listening to his message, and that is, science is good. We should continue to try to proceed with what we can do with technology. That being said, there's a sort of paradox that we're finding ourselves in, and I kind of want to push this back at you guys now. Here's the paradox that Pope Francis exposes in the encyclical. It's namely this: through social media, through the internet, through text messaging, all these technological ways of building relationships with others, in that sense, we're moving closer to one another. And yet, here's the paradox: the closer we move towards one another digitally, it seems as though the farther we move away from each other at a deeper, more profound personal level. Do you guys agree with Pope Francis on this?
Yeah, I mean, I constantly was thinking of Plato when I was reading this, and particularly his dialogue, the Phaedrus, and this new, famously this dialogue talks about the invention of writing. And, most people would see, like, they would just list all the great things this can do, but Plato highlights forgetfulness as being a grave concern. Now, that does not mean that he rejects, he's writing a dialogue, so it doesn't mean he rejects writing in toto, but, he's trying to help us see it for what it is, and trying to say that ideally, actual writing, which is about reality, should be more about the human soul's relation to reality. And so in some ways it's one step removed from that. So the thing that's interesting, and especially where he talks about the illusion of communication, is that we have these digital technologies that are called communication technologies, but yet as you showed, they're actually working against authentic communication.
Right.
So I think the thing that Pope Francis is trying to have us think a little bit more about is the medium in which we're the mediums of these social technologies. They aren't neutral. So you're not just communicating anything, but you have to communicate in a particular way that is in some ways one step removed from encountering the other, being in having embodied communication.
Right.
And he makes a lot about being in the presence of another, in dialogue. He even talks about the smell of the other. And I think that's really important. People have been talking about this for years. And I think a lot of his concerns about science and technology is just kind of it being an abstraction or ideology, which then is imposed on reality. What Francis, I see, what he wants is a genuine encounter with reality, an encounter with the other. And then the two, in their communication, having reality as being that kind of common good that they're both working towards.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned reality, and what you said prior to that really lines up with this next comment I want to make, because, and I didn't write the paragraph down, but in the encyclical, he actually sort of implicitly goes after scientism. Yeah. He says science is good. In fact, in a 2018 speech that he gave to the Pontifical Academy of Science, he said that the job of science is the charity of knowledge. Science has a job to do in the world, but always to be driven by charity. Again, there's that distinction between what can I do and what ought I do, and bringing ethics and the question of the human person, all this stuff into the dialogue. But he says reality is one, but even though reality is one, even though it's, yes, one whole, if we want to look at it that way, there's many different angles that we can come at reality. And science is one. And so he warns that we can, and this isn't the way that he's encouraging us to go, we can think that one single scientific advancement can be taken to completely overturn as a single perspective of something the way we've thought about things in the past. There can certainly be revolutionary discoveries in science, but what he's saying is, when it comes to reality, there's so many different ways that we can look at things and think about things, and different methodologies that we can adopt in order to come to that knowledge of the truth. And so I think Pope Francis is right to kind of usher these gentle and sometimes maybe a little more firm warnings, whether he's warning against environmental issues, whether it's something like these ideologies like scientism, which is, I'm sure, I know you guys know what that is, and I'm sure those watching know what it is, but in case they don't, that's just the belief that the only kind of true or valid knowledge is what can be discovered by science. So that would then discount the knowledge that we discover through things like philosophy or theology or likewise. That's right. And so he's warning against these things. So I think that where Pope Francis comes out, whether it's towards digital means of communication, whether it's towards science or scientific progress, I think he's actually quite merited to say the things he's saying as that gentle fatherly warning to all of us who have a common creator, that we should remember that we're stewards of God's creation and not to be manipulators. Yeah,
can I jump in here? It's interesting that he quotes at one point Love and Responsibility by Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II. And if I've got the page number right, the section that he's quoting is actually on, it has something to do with the gift of self that's seen in marriage. But, if you look at John Paul II and how he talks about knowledge and the subject-object relationship, it's a nuptial relation. So it's, instead of the subject imposing on the object, okay, or the object imposing on the subject, the two, in a way like Adam and Eve, come together, and they truly, there's an intimate knowledge that's there, an intimacy. And so I think, like, when he's talking about digital communication, when he's talking about science, is he's saying, you know what? Those ways of knowing can tend towards actually this violence, which is antithetical to the true ideal of knowing, which is like what we find in that intimate spousal knowledge. So, I mean, throughout this document, you find so many places where he's talking about violence, domination, all that stuff, and I think you should read all those other critiques in light of that.
I want to just be sure to flag before we move on from this topic, just this really important distinction that I think plays into what we've been talking about throughout here, this reality versus illusion stuff. And, to sort of imagine, not to imagine that we're living in a world where, as you said, Matt, where science is necessarily the thing that can solve all of our problems, right? Nor is technology the thing that can necessarily bring us together, right? He says in paragraph 43, digital connectivity is not enough to build bridges. It is not capable of uniting humanity. It's a tool, right? And so we have to figure out what to do with the tools that we have. But ultimately, we're still talking about actual, as you say, Bobby, actual encounter. And that can't be done virtually, in a manner of speaking.
Yeah.
And obviously, that's something that we're having to live through right now with, our whole lives upended by the virus that has overtaken the world, and working from home and doing everything by computers and all of that sort of thing. I certainly worry from time to time that there's a dehumanizing effect that is just as bad as the actual illness, right? And it seems to me that Pope Francis is concerned with many of the same things, not just in the context of what we're going through right now, but kind of a long-standing concern that you definitely see him develop in Laudato Si as well, where, he's just, very interested in articulating a more holistic vision of reality for people that takes into consideration things that a lot of people care about. And maybe that's something that is important about this document and about Laudato Si in comparison to the usual kinds of things that people both inside and outside the church are used to popes doing. Namely, Pope Francis is addressing all people of goodwill. And he's using a very particular, I think, strategic type of language that is designed to really bring more and more people into, his invitation towards a better reality. I think, therefore, to just circle back towards the very beginning, that it's no accident that he's using St. Francis of Assisi, just as he did in Laudato Si. He's really just choosing to focus on a figure who is able to both, this is a figure who has the admiration of people both inside and outside the church, right? And it's somebody who himself was historically able to kind of communicate, to dialogue, to kind of offer a better vision of reality, both for his brothers and sisters in Christ and for his brothers and sisters in the wider world. I mean, for goodness sake, when we get back to the word brother here, St. Francis of Assisi describes the celestial bodies and the whole of creation as brothers and sisters. That's part of our tradition.
And if you think about like going on St. Francis here, I mean, he was very concerned about even having things like a library. I mean, I'm just now thinking of this where he wants this kind of direct, encounter with reality as much as possible. And if you think about other great saints, and this is kind of what it stood out to me that Pope Francis is doing here, is he's knocking down idols. All of these idols that, in some ways are shaping us. And he says one time, we like to flee reality. You think about idolatry, people, they flee from reality. So what do we need to do? We need to knock down, he's knocking down those idols. I think St. Francis, that kind of radical figure like that, would do the same, having that direct encounter.
My reading of the first chapter is it's a rather pessimistic chapter, I would say, and I don't think that Pope Francis himself would say that there aren't times when a little pessimism is okay, right? I mean, happiness is not the same thing as joy, right? So we don't want to, as Christians, as evangelists, we don't want to put on a false face, right? We don't want to play into that same illusion that he's worried about technology, about the economy, about science, about whatever it may be, right? So there are times when we need to sort of be a little serious and somber. And, I know the Pope himself, Pope Francis, really admires Robert Hugh Benson's Lord of the World book. Like he has a kind of...
Talk about pessimism.
Yeah, I mean, he has a kind of like pessimistic, apocalyptic imagination sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that, just our opinions here, but what's wrong with that, really? I mean, it seems to me that Pope Francis understands that we're living in an age where things are shifting dramatically, and there are a lot of things that need to be thought through and maybe aren't being thought through correctly. And just to finish this thought, in his previous encyclical, Laudato Si, he quoted John the 23rd's, and actually referenced John the 23rd's Pacem in Terris encyclical, like sort of understanding that his own role as writing about the environment, and now maybe his own role in writing about sort of these wider issues of brotherhood on earth, is rooted in an actual crisis. Just as John the 23rd is writing Pacem in Terris with regard to the nuclear question, right? Now, maybe we'll read Fratelli Tutti in 100 years, and we'll still glean so many important things from it, but we'll also look at it and say, wow, the Pope was really concerned with a bunch of stuff that was going on in the world right then, and he was right to be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you think with COVID, that would like allow us to step back and say, hey, are we going in the right direction? But it seems like the technocratic paradigm is getting more and more enforced in response to it. And I mean, it just seems like this, going back to this, we've been held captive by something. And I think in Laudato Si, he identifies that as the technocratic paradigm. And so maybe, I mean, you can go back to John the 23rd and see, in his response to the arms race, that, we're being held captive by this idea that is not going to lead to a good end.
Right.
So I don't know. I that first part really resonated with me because I think I'm naturally an optimist, but experience has led me to be much more of a pessimist. So I just, the way I see things going, I'm like, oh man, everybody needs to read this because we just cannot continue the same. And he's calling people to a change of lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. However, and maybe Matt, you want to weigh in on the optimism, pessimism thing as well, but I do just want to wrap up my thought on this by saying, towards the end of that first chapter, he says, despite these dark clouds, which may not be ignored, I would like in the following pages to take up and discuss many new paths of hope. And I think that's important. New paths of hope that he raises. Matt, any thoughts about that?
New paths of hope. Well, I need to think about that a little bit. I do think that Bob is right in that what's been presented for us, given the current societal and really global conditions, given the pandemic, things happening politically, it's really causing us, and I think for good reason, to step back and reassess the way that we think, the way that we act, some of the assumptions we brought to the table in our life. I think that it's sort of been one of those, I don't know if we want to call it a rock bottom moment for the globe, but I think like in some way it's really shaken us up. And it's perhaps, I think probably high probability this is the once in a lifetime sort of experience that we're having right now. And if we don't reassess the ways that we're thinking and the ways that we're acting and the assumptions that we hold, that's not good, because if what's going on in the world now and what's going on in our lives, I mean, it hits close to home for all of us. If that's not enough to shake us up, and maybe with a little bit of careful pessimism, look at the way that we're doing things, then what's going to shake us up enough to do that? So I do think like what you have to do with this encyclical is read it in totality with the other encyclicals that Pope Francis has written. Pope Francis is not a pessimistic Holy Father. But I do think that there's something kind of like the George MacDonald idea of a father, easy to please and hard to satisfy. There are positive elements of this encyclical, to be sure. And I like how he amidst some of the criticism, some of the more critical comments that he makes, he does gently urge us in the direction of the virtues of love and hope and faith and the cardinal virtues like temperance and fortitude and these sorts of things. I do think that the continual emphasis on brotherhood and love throughout this entire encyclical is really the implicitly optimistic part of the whole thing. Is even though there's a little bit of sort of note of reprimand there, there's still ultimately this undertone of, come on, you can do it.
Right.
Here's the right direction. So there's sort of a mix, I think, of pessimism and optimism, and I don't think reading it in both of those lights is wrong, provided you read the encyclical in both of those lights.
Right, and maybe this comes back to just, I can't sort of let go of the word brotherhood, because I think, like, again, if we don't really reckon with what that really means, then we could think, well, you read this document and it just seems like kind of a banal response to something very serious. Like the world has all these problems and, we just need to kind of get along better or something. But in fact, there's a deep theological significance to what Pope Francis is offering in this sort of new path of hope through this lens of brotherhood. Bobby?
Yeah, well, maybe not in a theological sense that I'll approach this, but like just thinking about like Aristotle's definition of man is the animal that, the rational animal, or the animal that speaks, or the animal with speech that's in the logos. I mean, it seems like what Francis brings up, and this is brought up continually throughout the Catholic social tradition, is the common good. So, because we have a common nature, and because we both share in the logos, we both can then draw our attention to the good. Okay, and that doesn't kind of come through like a particular tradition that then separates us, but that the good is what unites us, and that transcends us. And I think he's kind of pointing us in that direction. I mean, he talks about dialogue all the time. Once again, the word logos, dialogos, making our way towards that. And so I think that kind of transcendent dimension is of the common good is going to then unite us as a family.
Right. And I think the way that he invites us into the common good in this document is really interesting.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just take note of the fact that he spends the second chapter doing a kind of Ignatian invitation into the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
So it's not enough in a way to just sort of say, here are the principles of Catholic social teaching. We believe in subsidiarity and solidarity. We believe in social justice. We have these terms, right, that we can kind of prescribe to the world. But of course, and he says right at the very beginning of the document that he's not looking like, he's referring to St. Francis of Assisi, but that St. Francis of Assisi wasn't trying to impose on people, right?
Yeah.
And this also connects to the thinking of Pope Benedict XVI and others. Really, the whole thrust of the Catechism of the Catholic Church too is the idea of proposing something. And the best way to propose, especially to a world that doesn't know Christ, that doesn't have the language of theology, that would require a lot of explaining, even to get to kind of the bottom line. And we do that at Word on Fire, obviously trying to explain what all this stuff is about. But the idea of inviting someone to be in the story.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's a real stroke of genius that Pope Francis chose this parable of the Good Samaritan, because again, that's a story that's directly from the lips of Jesus, so it's entirely Christian, but it is also something that just about any person of goodwill, as he describes in the beginning, can identify with and say, that is an edifying story.
Yes. Yeah.
And where am I in that story? Where can I be doing things better? All of that. Any thoughts on that and sort of the way that he deals with that, or sort of where to go from there?
Matt, do you want?
Well, maybe I will, because I have a little precursor comment to probably what you're going to say, is I like how this is just going back to something you said a few moments ago before we jump straight in headfirst to the Good Samaritan parable. Excuse me. So there, in those opening pages of the encyclical, is a sort of discussion of dialogue. And I think Pope Francis says some really important things there. And I couldn't help but read some of what he was saying there in a sort of Pascalian spirit, because he's making a point that Blaise Pascal made in the 17th century as he wrote in his Pensées about how we're supposed to reach a culture that is indifferent towards God, indifferent towards their final end, their purpose and meaning of life. And he talks about how we have to make Christianity attractive. That's Pascal who says that. Now, Pope Francis, kind of in a even more preliminary way, says we have to make dialogue attractive. We have to, if we're going to walk with our brother and seek truth together, we have to make the encounter where we do that desirable and attractive. If it becomes two people kind of monologuing at each other instead of an actual dialogue, there's a problem there. And so I think that, the fact that he sort of starts with this discussion of dialogue, and then kind of moves us, immerses us really into a story that Jesus uses when he's dialoguing with others. It sort of takes us into a deep dive into the master himself and how he did it. So it's kind of like a hidden, I think, gem of the way he does it is he takes us from talking about how we need to dialogue with charity with our brothers and sisters to then taking us directly into the words of Jesus himself, who is, the ultimate model of how to do it.
Yeah, it seems therefore rather bizarre, don't you think, that like people would read this document and sort of not find Christ in it?
Yeah. I mean, think you say like like in a way, dialogue, right, is mutually attending to the reality that's in front of us, and the Good Samaritan is that story. You have everybody trying to avoid the concrete reality that's in front of them, and the one who attends is, the Christ-like one, if you want to say. But I mean, I just find that I love this Good Samaritan because Jesus, right, in the narrative form, he doesn't try to, propose arguments, but he encompasses everybody into this story. The parables are amazing. I mean, like you could just spend your whole life exploring these.
Indeed. And can you, just remember for those who haven't taken a look at Luke chapter 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan recently, it starts with a lawyer asking Jesus, what must he do to inherit eternal life? Asking a question which Jesus, which he answers correctly. The lawyer answers the question correctly. Sorry, I'm just looking at it right now. But then Jesus says to him, you've given the right answer. Do this and you will live. So the guy gets the right answer. But then Jesus elaborates on that, right? Because how many people in the world, if you ask them, like, how should you live responsibly in this way or that way, right? They might be able to provide the right answer. They know the right answer. And yet it doesn't always line up with their action.
Yeah.
And so that's the brilliance, if I may be so bold as to say, of Jesus' parable, right? Is that he then invites them into a story, and Pope Francis, following his Lord and Master and ours, does the same, which I think is a very significant move that he makes here in the text.
Yeah. I mean, they cut to the heart, right?
It does. And, Pope Francis, this is another thing that I keep coming back to as somebody who's, an American, a Westerner, somebody who's always in my life enjoyed a pretty comfortable existence. I think to myself often, who is really in Pope Francis's heart? Now, obviously, I'm not in his brain. I don't know, but I do know that he's from a part of the world that sees more poverty than where we sit, and there are all these places in the world where there's just so much poverty and that sort of thing. So on the one hand, I'm thinking to myself, I think like he has a clear vision of who that beaten man is by the side of the road, and not all of us do. Yeah. To be honest. I mean, even though it's all around us and all of that sort of thing, it's really a challenge for us all, and not something that we should just dismiss out of hand.
Well, now we have we don't live in societies anymore in which like you have to like walk past the homeless man. You could just close your window and act like he's not there. And now even like with the technologies that we have and globalization, we can, take advantage of all these other peoples without even thinking twice about them.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Let's shift gears a little bit into a couple of other topics. Matt, you see some possible connections here to the thought of René Girard. Explain that to us. How do you see that?
Yeah, well, I actually owe this to Matt Becklow, one of our colleagues here at Word on Fire, for spotting this, and he's bang on. So for those who aren't familiar with René Girard was one of the great Catholic intellectuals of the 20th century. I think he died just after the turn of the 21st century. He was a French intellectual. He, while teaching literature earlier on in his career, came to discover a sort of mechanism, a way of reading culture, which integrated then this theory integrated then understanding of things like ritual and religion and violence, and really brought together. It was a very comprehensive way of seeing the world and understanding the phenomenon that unfold in human experience. Now, to really dive in deep to what his theory was, that's certainly not something that we're going to be able to do today. But Girard has had a significant impact on Bishop Barron. In fact, I think Bishop Barron has went so far as to say that he, in future generations will look back at Girard and see him as something like a or a modern church father. That's how significant his thought is. And in a nutshell, what Girard said is, part of the universal human experience is that we have desires. And much of our desires actually come from something called mimesis. Now, that was a fancy word that Girard used for something like imitation. So what happens is people have something that we desire, or maybe they act in a way we desire, or they just are someone we desire to be. And so we begin to imitate them. But there's sort of a reciprocating effect here now, because what Girard said is once you start imitating this other person, they'll start imitating you. And so you get into this cycle where suddenly this mutual imitation becomes competition. Competition over time, as it intensifies, then can lead to violence. And so Girard said, once we get to this point of violence, the way that it's often resolved is through his famous scapegoat mechanism, which is, again, in oversimplified terms, it's identifying somebody or a group of people who become your sort of new target for violence. So if you're competing against somebody, your focus is going to be on them as quote unquote the enemy, right? But the way that Girard said communities or societies or cultures resolve this tension between competitors is to identify somebody else to take the brunt of the violence, and they become the scapegoat. And this is a sort of false or ersatz resolution to the violence, where you turn your focus on each other as, again, quote unquote enemies, to this scapegoat who then takes the brunt of the violence. And so this in short is what Girard was thinking as he read all of these works of classical literature, from Dostoevsky to Proust to Stendhal and others, and saw this emerging trend through them all. So then he got thinking, well, this must be something that is universal, that is sort of written into the fabric of human nature and into us as a social being. And I think he was right. Now, Pope Francis, in a couple paragraphs in this encyclical, warns against collectively coming together to persecute others, or in ways like that. He implies a sort of Girardian tendency that we have, and warns us against it. Now, whether or not he was actually thinking of René Girard when he wrote this, I have no idea. But I do think, again, it's an affirmation of this important idea that this French thinker had, that I think we need to pay attention to as it now rises up in this brand new encyclical. And I think I have the paragraphs written down. So to write down, if you want to go and read these Girardian paragraphs in Pope Francis' encyclical, it's paragraph 242 and 266. But I don't know if you guys have anything to add to what I just said.
Well, I mean, I'm in Girard's thought, right? I'm not that fluent in it, but I mean, the little that I do know is that, right, all these ways of coming together after the fall, if you want to put it that way, right, involve a scapegoat, unless total violence is going to just totally rip the community apart. Right. And so, but like in order, so to have that cohesiveness, you need something like the scapegoat. I mean, right. Nietzsche, right, famously sees that war is good for a nation every now and then, because you need a common enemy and scapegoat. Yeah. And whether or not that's justified doesn't matter. I mean, you, otherwise the community is going to tear itself apart. And knowing that, a lot of politicians take advantage of just constructing a scapegoat. And but the thing is that's interesting with Girard, right, is that all of the things that all the literature from the past justified it in some way, but yet the Gospels expose it.
That's right.
And so they expose the mechanism. But Girard, doesn't he see that as like, in some way, okay, you do have the creation of the church, the community that is based on the one who allows himself to be the scapegoat, and exposes the lie. But that does mean that the city of man is going to be exposed for what it is, and based on the founder, the liar. And my thing though is with Fratelli Tutti, I hope that becomes a little bit more explicit, because and I think he does at the end, right? He gets into kind of the theological stuff, like only in Christ will we have the true brotherhood of mankind. Otherwise, I mean, without that, we are going to inevitably construct a scapegoat.
Well, it's true because I'm glad you added that, because that's the most important part of the theory is how then Jesus comes onto the scene, and Christianity really provides the sort of the ultimate myth that sort of turns everything on its head and exposes everything. Girard says that in Christianity, in the scriptures, in Christ as the in his atoning sacrifice, compared to all the myths that precede it, in all the myths that precede it, the scapegoat is seen as guilty, is understood to be guilty, but when in Christ's case, we understand the scapegoat this time to be innocent.
Yes.
So there's these contrasts that Girard draws out. I think this is important, and it's important for how we understand our culture today, and I think what Pope Francis is trying to get us to do. Girard talks about the mob mentality. I mean, we all know that that's something we're all thinking about that right now, because we're seeing this sort of mob mentality unfold in many different ways, both online and on the streets in our own countries, right? And so this is poignant and I think important to hear from Pope Francis. And so I think it just acts as a good bridge to another thinker. And that's why I wanted to bring up Girard, is so that people maybe move from the encyclical and add some, introductory books on René Girard to their book piles.
I think this is significant, and that's well spotted, and we'll definitely give thanks to our colleague Matt Becklow for helping us think it through too. I just want to add, so Matt, you just referenced paragraph 247. That's in this section about memory. And something just triggered in my mind as you were talking, and I was looking at the paragraph right before that now again, yes. So the gospel, the good news of God in Christ is the answer, is the only answer. But we also have these kind of, and I think it's clear that Pope Francis has this practical concern also to sort of try to dialogue, like we've been talking about, to sort of like try to offer a solution, even an imperfect solution that can sort of bind people together who aren't Christian as well. And I think that this idea of memory, he says, forgetting is never the answer, is super important. And it reminded me of the Old Testament prophets. And there's actually something of the Old Testament prophet about this document in certain respects, I think. In certain ways, it's like reading passages in Jeremiah or Amos or something like that. And in Jeremiah in particular, this idea of remember, is super duper important. That for the people to know, right? So that God's justice can be done. So I think that there's something to that going on here, because then he moves into, the Shoah must not be forgotten, the Holocaust, right? Atomic bombs and all these other things, like these things that like we as a humanity need to like keep in our minds and remember, that we as Christians do believe sort of only ultimately makes sense through the lens of the gospel. But we can kind of invite people along pretty far down the road as well. Which then reminds me to ask you, Bobby, about this question of just the nature of the individual and the idea of formation. Like what do you think Pope Francis is proposing here, as far as like what needs to happen in terms of like just the way we think, the way we're formed, like all these kinds of things, so that we can live in this image of brotherhood better? I think there's a section he talks about historical consciousness, right? And so like just I'm kind of thinking of one of the guys that got the Ratzinger Prize a couple of years ago, Charles Taylor, and this like idea that we all of our ways of what do you call sources of the self, right? Okay, everything, the way we think about reality, our communities, is always in some ways an inheritance from the past, and we only know ourselves, right, when we actually know the past well. But there's a lot of people, right, who want to construct a new kind of like united humanity that wants to do the exact opposite of what Francis wants to do, which is don't remember, because that's going to then bring out all of these passions and tensions from the past. And there are people who can abuse memory. You think political figures who say, oh, remember when this happened in World War II, and people don't follow that up with And it seems like Francis gets into that, right? I mean, like the ability of a certain type of leader to manipulate. But like, for example, I'm thinking about things too in church history right now. There's all these debates, right, about
about, like, oh, is this, authentic Catholic teaching, or questions about development, etc. And I used to teach a church history class, and I thought one of the best things that class did, which, by the way, some people did not want to have that class because they thought it was like, oh, why do we need to cover things like the Crusades, Inquisition, all that bad stuff? We're just turning kids away from the church. Or, but when you actually get into the nitty-gritty of those events, yes, darkness and light is shown there, but the kids, they need to see how the church is in history, and that it, as Bishop Barron constantly talks about, it grows and develops, and to see all those different stages of its development is important to knowing what it is. So, like, a lot of people think, I used to sometimes cover the history of any topic as important because, like, you don't need to know a lot about Newton or even about, like, Kepler to be a good, physicist or astronomer. But in order to know how you got from him to the one who critiqued him to where we are now is really important to understanding what this whole thing is about. So, I mean, I think memory is really important. I mean, it's tying all things together, right? Is with the word memory, isn't it kind of like a collecting of all together? And you have to have that.
It seems to me, and maybe you want to jump in on this too, Matt, that it also connects back to this concern about technology and science and stuff as well. Like, are we just rewarding in our societies the people who are best able to play this technocratic game? Yeah. Right? The richest and most powerful people are the people who are able to kind of check all the right boxes to get to the top of this sort of technocratic elite, and they're not really humanely formed. That there's something missing then that then sort of creates from the top down this disparity of charity in a sense.
Well, this goes back to let's say Pope Benedict and Rene Girard. Now, Pope Benedict pointed out that we progress too fast. Like we are great at science. We're great at developing our technological abilities, our technological functions as a society, but we can't keep up, at least ethically. There's a lot of questions to be asked about how to use these things as we develop them and how to go about these processes that we can now undergo that we couldn't before in the labs and elsewhere. And so there's sort of this disjunction between the speed of which progress technologically and in the scientific realm is happening and the and ethical progress of society along with it. So that's a problem. We have to deal with that. But here's the thing. So you get these influencers, if we want to use the popular word in the culture today, influencers who have these gigantic platforms and have the means in order to become these greatly influential figures in the culture. If they happen to be morally troubled, if their ethics have not caught up with the progress that they're making, that society is making with technology, with science, then what we have is many people who nonetheless, who maybe aren't aware of the problem, haven't thought about it, imitating them. And so you get a trickle-down effect from the influencers of society who have tons of power because of the means that they have, the unique means they have to become influential in the culture. But because they're influencers, we then get this modeling that's happening.
Yeah, to this point, if I could just jump in real quick, Bobby, and then throw it to you. I think one of my very favorite passages in Fratelli Tutti is paragraph 197, where I really think he sort of, Pope Francis sort of pauses and preaches, frankly, for a moment to the culture that is just lost in imitation, sort of, and just sort of doesn't know what the end to anything is anymore. And he says this, I want to read it. He says, at times in thinking of the future, we do well to ask ourselves, why am I doing this? What is my real aim? For as time goes on, reflecting on the past, the questions will not be how many people endorsed me, how many people voted for me, how many had a positive image of me. The real and potentially painful questions will be, how much love did I put into my work? What did I do for the progress of our people? What mark did I leave on the life of society? What real bonds did I create? What positive forces did I unleash? How much social peace did I sow? What good did I achieve in the position that was entrusted to me? Yeah. That is just a mic drop right there, in my view. Just what a powerful word to speak to our culture. Bobby, any thoughts on that?
Definitely. I mean, that he preached to me. I needed to hear that.
Yeah.
And I had this moment one night after reading this. I was like, oh my gosh, the common good. It all is the common good. It makes so much sense. Like, if you are, say, an influencer and you're just thinking about likes, or you're thinking about,
Patreon,
all of these other kind of individual interests, but you don't have the common good as your kind of point of reference, then what are you doing? Right. So like you have this this imitation going on where everybody now wants to get involved in that, and it's a further distancing from the common good. So I mean, we got to think too, like pause for a second. Like whenever, and this is what we just don't do, is like he talks about serene reflection at one point. We need to have more serene reflection, because if we don't think about let's take Twitter, for example, or just another social media platform. Like, I don't know about you, but me, what do I look at? Do I sometimes even frame my message in a way that I know will get a certain response? Now, maybe that is serving the common good, and it just happens to be a little provocative. Or do I do things just like, what is my real intention here?
Yeah, such an important question.
Yeah, and he talks about breaking down self-esteem. I mean, think about the I generation. All these. I had a student one time tell me, I need to change my brand. I'm like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
This thing is shaping the way you think about yourself.
Right.
And so let's pause and think about all these things.
Okay, but here just to stay on the Girardian theme. Think about this now. You can't avoid imitation. It's written into the way we are as human beings. We do imitate. Yeah. Most of us do it unwittingly. But the bottom line is we're an imitative creature. Who better to imitate than Jesus Christ? This is sort of a Jordan Peterson thing, right? He's saying, look at Jesus Christ as the grand archetype, right, of who it is we need to model ourselves after. And so now, again, it's too bad. We should maybe have like a competition on, say, Twitter to say like, who is the most Christ-like tweeter in the world? Yeah. And then we should all go study their Twitter account so we can see at least how maybe we might conduct ourselves online. But I think the point is, imitation isn't a bad thing. It's something we all do. Yeah. But who are you imitating? You know?
Here, to that point, something that I think is in my mind anyway, as I read Fratelli Tutti, just as it's in my mind when I read Laudato Si, is I think Pope Francis is keenly aware of something that I think about a lot, namely, your typical human being walking around in the world today maybe doesn't even think of himself as a creature, So we've got to kind of back up to this prior starting point to even then get into this realization of then what creatureliness does to people and all of that. I think that's missed out sometimes.
Are you talking about in terms of my very self has been given to me, and everything, brother, sister, brother, sun, sister, moon,
right?
Everything in some ways.
Well, just think, right? I mean, coming back to your student's comment about changing their brand, right?
Yeah.
We can kind of come to live in this world as if we are our own makers.
Yes.
Yeah. Right? We don't think of ourselves enough that we are made.
Yeah.
And if we start with that, if we stipulate that we've been made, then a whole lot of other things flow from that. But if we don't have that, then my goodness, where are we going, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, and this goes back to what Benedict was kind of pointing out in John Paul II, was like in the modern era, we see ourselves as masters.
Right.
And, that has to change. The kind of Marian fiat, let it be done to be according to thy word. I mean, I receive myself as a gift. I mean, talk about fighting self-esteem problems. I mean, when you say I'm a gift of the all good God, and I am good.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
I don't create my own goodness.
Indeed. Well, in the few minutes that remain, maybe we can just sort of take stock of, what kind of the takeaways are, what kind of the solution might be that Pope Francis is proposing. We've deliberately stayed away from some of the like specific issues that have been raised here that are super important, but just kind of not what we are about as evangelists. But they certainly might play into the way that we think about wrapping this thing up. I mean, Pope Francis talks about immigration. He talks about, political solutions to kind of toxic populism and stuff like that. He talks about, religious conflicts. He talks about just a lot of issues that are kind of live in the world today. So he's obviously like very concerned with the way we, not only Catholics, his flock, but all the people of the earth are actually living their lives. So I don't know, like Matt, any takeaways for you about like, ways that we might live differently or what Pope Francis is getting at in here?
Well, I just think that we need to meditate on the central theme of this whole thing, which is I wouldn't even say it's fraternity. I think it's love.
Yeah.
1 Corinthians chapter 13, St. Paul tells us that if you have not love, you have nothing. And so I think we just need to get back to contemplating, this simple word and what it means. And I think we can use this encyclical to do that. There's a great paragraph, paragraph 93. Pope Francis turns to St. Thomas Aquinas and draws from the Summa. And also in the preceding paragraph, I believe it's right before. It would make sense if it was. He talks about how Aristotle proposed sort of the precursor to what St. Thomas would eventually say, which was that love is willing the good of the other. But Pope Francis also points out that St. Thomas tells us that love involves a union with the other. Mm-hmm. And I think that anything short of that, is falling short of love. I think that's a radical idea, that to love anybody is going to involve some sort of union of persons. And so unity of mind, perhaps, in seeking the truth together, even unity in proximity, again, just not that digital closeness is a bad thing, but it's not sufficient for us to maintain solid relationships. So I think in this time of digital enabling, where we don't have to be close to each other to be very involved in each other's lives, I think we have to make a renewed effort to be close to each other in person.
And maybe that plays into part of this like illusion thing, right? Like we can feel closer and closer to people, and yet maybe there isn't as much love in our lives as there has been in previous times when we were frankly more dependent upon each other in certain respects. I mean, love, it seems to me, is at the very top of a long list of words that frankly we just don't know what they mean anymore in the year 2020. So maybe reading the document will like spur people on to think of the proper definition. Bobby?
I've heard some philosophers say that maybe we should ban the word love for like 100 years, just so it recovers its...
to reset it?
Like real meaning. But yeah, Matt, I was going to say the same thing. That stood out. Like the question I kept hearing Francis asking is, are we ready to accept that love indeed is the reality? We oftentimes think, oh well, this is just he talks about ideal a lot, but that is the real. Mm-hmm. I think oftentimes in our sinful minds we think, oh no, well, it's something I'll strive for, or talk about the union of a husband and a wife coming into true communion together. That we're still at the end of the day just two egos, two individuals, creating this thing. Mm-hmm. But no, Christianity is all about that. Actually, love precedes everything else, and it's the final goal of all things. And in Christ that has become manifest. So that's the hope that I see Francis kind of pointing us towards. That indeed that is the reality. So that's what I take away from that.
Yeah, I would just say in closing, I hope people will pay attention to the end. In paragraph 277, he says, "For us, the wellspring of human dignity and fraternity is the gospel of Jesus Christ. It couldn't be any clearer. Obviously, Christians need to interact with people of other religions, and Catholics work and pray for people to come into the church and all of that. But we also have to face the reality that there are people of other religions, and those religions contain a lot of goodwill for other people as well, and we have to make connections where we can. But for us as Catholics, we really do need to take away from this document that we definitely need to stay focused on this wellspring of human dignity and fraternity, the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, anything else, guys?
I think we covered it.
All right. Well, with that, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today and to talk together about Fratelli Tutti. For the Word on Fire Institute, Matthew Nelson, Robert Mixa, I'm Andrew Petiprin. Thanks.